Той е преподавател и специалист в областта на регенеративния плейсмейкинг в Университета за приложни науки Ин Холанд и Еразъм университета в Роттердам. Ръководи лаборатория, която изследва социалните динамики през призмата на градския туризъм. Архитект по образование, Донах Хорган работи по проекти на ПРООН и Европейската комисия за развитие на градската среда чрез въвличане на общности. И сега той ще ни разкаже повече за своята работа.
Благодаря и благодаря за покане. My name is Dонах Хорган, and I'm Irish originally, but based in the Netherlands for the past 3 years. And I lead a living lab, which looks at urban transitions and societal transitions through the lens of urban leisure and tourism. So today I'll talk to you a bit about how we work around the topic of regenerative placemaking, and give you a bit of an indication about a living lab, what a living lab is, and some of the methods we use, which are very, I suppose, resonant with what we heard in the panel just before lunch, in terms of a kind of engagement-led practice. So really happy to be here, and blagodaria, as I said. Okay, so as I said, we run, I run I lead a living lab, which is in a University of Applied Sciences, and I'll tell you in a while what a living lab is exactly, but essentially it's about taking learning from the university out into the community. So we do placemaking for students and universities, and we focus on highly complex issues in a fluid and uncertain experimental environment. This can be overwhelming, which we will talk about as I go through the presentation, especially in terms of generating engagement and ownership over outcomes. Placemaking, as I understand it, is a social practice, and it's the process in which the quality of place is improved through active intervention in built environment and the reproduction of sustainable, resilient communities. In this way, regenerative placemaking involves reigniting our relationships with natural environments, with our neighbours and communities, just as we saw in the example before the break, and cultural heritage across a whole in a transversal way. We're based in Rotterdam. We are 2 living labs, so both living labs are located in peripheral areas of the city. The first one established in Amsterdam Noord, around 10 years ago, and ours established 5 years later in Rotterdam Zuid. And Rotterdam Zuid is essentially a peripheral part of the city of Rotterdam, Rotterdam being the second biggest urban conurbation in the Netherlands, and a place that I suppose has undergone a lot of transformation over the past 100 years in particular. So Rotterdam was annihilated at the end of World War II. So the entire city was flattened, apart from some very, very small pockets. And following this, Rotterdam became a site of experimentation in the kind of post-war periods. It has the most kind of modernist architecture in the Netherlands, so not really the same as the chocolate box kind of style that we see in somewhere like Delft or Amsterdam. A very kind of brutalist, kind of modernist cityscape, very much built around the car. So in the past 20 years in particular, we've seen a lot of change. In particular, I suppose, a very neoliberal development style. So the city's positive economic development is underpinned by a conscious gentrification approach. So in Rotterdam, gentrification is the policy. It's a naked policy that the gemeente, the government, would not argue with you, argue with the statement that gentrification is the intention. And they are seeking essentially to upgrade the population of Rotterdam into more affluent citizens. So this conscious gentrification approach increases housing development for middle and higher income groups, and thus reduces the share of social housing for low income groups across the board. So this is the context in which we're engaging with in terms of our research. This spatial development approach has invited criticism because stakeholders are keen for Rotterdam to avoid the trajectory of other Dutch cities that have deeply felt impacts of over-tourism and loss of identity. So if you think about the city of Amsterdam, which is now post-COVID, receiving upwards of 22 million visitors a year, and that has significant impacts in terms of the spatial development of that city. So Rotterdam is trying to have a more inclusive approach. So scholars use the example of Katendrecht, which is an old port neighborhood that was a real bastion of socialism, certainly kind of during World War II, to describe a neighborhood that has been redeveloped at the cost of old residents. So in general in Rotterdam, but looking at Katendrecht and areas of Rotterdam Zuid, as harbour activities were moved out of the city and into the estuary, the area lost its traditional function. Private tenured housing gradually replaced workers' housing, while a former steamship, the SS Rotterdam, was positioned along the quay as a hotel and visitor attraction. So the port area, which holds a lot of the keys to Rotterdam's multicultural and very varied history, is now a site of gentrification and neoliberal urban development. So there's an urgent need to delve into the structural dynamics perpetuating inequalities within cities, delving deeper into the complex interplay of capital concentration, class struggle dynamics, and the resultant enforced immobilities. As a growing post-industrial urban destination, Rotterdam offers a unique and developing case within which socio-spatial inequalities and opportunities of tourism can be examined at the local level. So I'm an architect by background, but for the past 5 years I've been in a tourism area. So we use the frame of tourism to understand urban development. And within that, I suppose our understanding, or from an academic perspective, we follow, I suppose, the new urban tourism paradigm. And this doesn't separate local people from visitors. New urban tourism understands that if you can provide good quality infrastructure for local people, then this will be attractive to others. So our first chief kind of obligation is to the local, and that's the context of our work. So as I said, placemaking is something that we engage with, and we see it as social practice. At its best, it could be a visionary and progressive philosophy underpinning pioneering urban design principles and practices. And it's the process in which the quality of a place is improved through active intervention in the built environment and in the production and reproduction of sustainable and resilient communities, as I said before. And this needs to depend on co-creation and the participation of those communities in this. So we kind of, I suppose, look at urban development through the lens of placemaking and question, is it place-making or place-taking? So who is it for? Who is the urban development process for? And as I said, place branding efforts in the south of Rotterdam, in places like Rijnhaven and Koop van Zuid and Katendrecht, that have accompanied the construction of new homes and the arrival of creative entrepreneurs, have created tourist hotspots, but also created a lot of displacement. So in Rotterdam, essentially, populations are being displaced in a very kind of 1970s, 1980s kind of gentrification way to the edges of the city, to places like Barendrecht, and essentially right down to the border with Belgium. If we look, for example, again at the case of Katendrecht, which was labeled as new authentic Rotterdam, it suffered from crime in the past and lots of serious social problems, and regeneration has been seen as the way to essentially fix some of these social problems. This is about to get worse in terms of the amount of development that's going to happen there. So given the concerns around gentrification and neighbourhood change in the area and Rotterdam South more broadly, we seek to follow a sustainable pathway that creates vibrant spaces for locals and visitors, and this is what our Living Lab looks at. So as I said, we look at societal transitions through a lens of urban and leisure and tourism, and understanding what tourism strategies can be useful for safeguarding the uniqueness of Rotterdam's cultural islands. We're involved in research, and one of the big projects that we're involved in is around producing inclusive cities. It's a driving urban transitions program, so funded by what used to be the JPI, if anyone kind of knows about European research mechanisms. And just before I suppose I take you through what a Living Lab is, This project is representative of the types of projects that we're involved in. We also are involved in education, which I'll explain to you. But this is European research project with cases in Rotterdam, in Vienna, Oslo, in Budapest, and several other places. And this is about developing innovative methods, tools, and practices for inclusive spatial production. And what this is about is, I suppose, ensuring multi-generational and gender-inclusive uses of public spaces. It's about granting access to natural assets. So in the past, the port of Rotterdam was a very important place, and in moving the port and facilitating a lot of gentrification out into the estuary, we are left with lots of old embankments, lots of old port areas that are neglected, that have no function anymore, and are still actually not brought into public use in terms of a spatial commons. So through this project and through other research, we're seeking to grant access to natural assets, so like we heard there from Martin before, while safeguarding vulnerable groups from the adverse effects like gentrification and commercialization. This project is about providing cities with clear guidance on implementing critical and inclusive placemaking, integrating them systemically into urban planning processes. This is about expanding placemaking strategies to activate public spaces in the framework of 15-minute city concepts by critically assessing current process of placemaking, so being critical also about placemaking and its impact on gentrification, and communicate the process and results throughout Europe. I understand that this is a very academic presentation, but as we go through it, hopefully it'll become more interesting for you. So let me tell you a bit about what Living Labs are. So Living Labs are a user-centered open innovation ecosystem which are based on systemic co-creation processes. They include research and innovation processes that are integrated into real-life community settings. So the real-life community context of our work is really important. So we are located in what in the Netherlands is called an anti-crack, an old ABN AMRO bank that was left neglected. And so we are in there as a meanwhile space to stop squatting and craqueros from being there. So we're really very much embedded in the community. What we're involved in is very much around prototyping and testing, so developing prototypes like we saw the amazing prototypes in the panel before us, and also scaling up these innovations. Living Labs are long-term and place-based, so they're not really about kind of short projects that kind of dip in and out of a context, but it's about developing long-lasting relationships over a long period of time. As I said, the kind of context, the community context of being really embedded in the community is really important for us, and therefore we work with the quadruple helix, or what is more known as the quintuple helix now, which means that we work with public sector partners, private sector partners, educational and academic partners, and the community, and the fifth being nature as a stakeholder when we talk about the quintuple helix. And this is represented here. So, as I said, kind of Living Labs aren't necessarily a panacea for generating community engagement. And like we heard kind of in the context of Bulgaria, there's very low trusts in the neighborhoods that we're working in. So if you take Rotterdam Zuid, where our lab is located, we have 185 languages spoken in the area. It's a majority-minority situation, so that means that the minorities are in the majority. So indigenous Dutch populations are in the minority. And we're working very much with this issues that relate to social cohesion, so how to develop social cohesion within an area where community potentially is very conflicted. And as we heard about the, I suppose, voting turnout in some of the communities that are colleagues that are Bulgarian colleagues have been working in, the area that I work in is the lowest voting ward in the Netherlands. So it has less than 20% population in democratic decision making, and it's also a place that during COVID and around that time the Dutch government decided to take back benefits from communities that were perceived to be wrongly in receipt of benefits, which turned into a massive scandal as it turned out that this wasn't the case. So there's a very, very low trust in local government. which means that we operate as a neutral actor within this context. As I said, living labs aren't a panacea. Many labs are project-based. They can be only maybe dependent on European funding, which can be up to 3 or 4 years. Often local stakeholders are expected to want to participate voluntarily, but as we know and as we've heard from local context here, that's not always the case, and we have to work iteratively in terms of sowing those relationships and getting people to trust us, to work with us. So we have a strong focus on developing tools and methods that can be implemented again in order to generate that trust and relationships with local people. Sometimes there are a lot of overblown expectations in terms of what we can actually do. And it's unrealistic to suggest that living labs can solve wicked societal problems, but they can certainly illuminate them and help to prototype solutions within that context. So let me tell you a bit about the 2 living labs that we have. As I said, the first one was originated in Amsterdam North, which is the north of Amsterdam. If any of you have been to the city of Amsterdam, it's the part over the river, which used to be traditionally an industrial area and had a lot of workers' housing, and because of pressures on development in Rotterdam, Amsterdam North is now a site of extreme spatial transformation, so hyper-gentrification and loss of local identity, displacement, etc. So, as I told you, we work with a new urban tourism paradigm which focuses on quality of life for all citizens. So we see visitors and local people as all temporal city users. The time is just different. So we're working in these peripheral locations, and we're trying to develop from the bottom up user-centered open innovation ecosystems that are integrated into the real life and real problems of these communities. And essentially what we're about is testing. So living labs commonly use design thinking. Some of you might be familiar with design thinking. Essentially, it's the way that we inherently think of as architects in terms of using design as an inquiry method to solve problems. So seeing design thinking as a rational problem-solving technique in terms of a double diamond, kind of an open and closed policy of experimentation, the same way that you would with a pen in your sketchbook evolve design ideas. We do this through the Living Lab, but also thinking about design thinking as reflective practice. So how can design thinking and I suppose different types of design-led games, design participation tools, how can these encourage joint problematization, so co-creation in terms of identifying problems that then can be solved also together. It's continuous, iterative, and involves failed experiments, just like how we engage with architectural design, architectural practice. And both approaches have value for different questions. So in this way, a living lab becomes a platform for engaging with societal transitions in the real world and all the uncertainties that exist around that. They can be appreciated by public and professional stakeholders since we're all in this together. As I said before, Rotterdam, the context that I operated in, similar to Amsterdam North, engages with the kind of gentrification-led policies that are top-down coming from the city. So, as I said, the powers that be in Rotterdam really just want to displace existing population who they might think is a bit rough around the edges with a kind of affluent population. And that happens even within the city. So we have migration of high-income individuals coming from not only Amsterdam or Den Haag or other parts of the Netherlands, but also from the north of Rotterdam to the south of the city. So we have active gentrification agents in our own city. And because of the spatial development of the city, which, as I said, was post-war and was a rapid reconstruction of the city following very similar principles to, as we heard in our first presentation this morning, in terms of what the principles that would have come out of Siam in terms of trying to create really utopias or slightly socially engineered places. So Rotterdam already kind of suffers from some of the dysfunction of that very, very top-down planning that maybe didn't sufficiently integrate those utopian ideas as the same is with other kind of post-war redevelopment. So how do we do this? So essentially the tools that we use are very much probably familiar to you around place exploration and sense making. So we have a whole set of tools kind of in this area. This one, for example, as you see here, is a kind of place mapping tool, and we work in both research and education. So in an educational context, as we're based within a university, traditionally we used to host a 1 semester long challenge-based minor, which is open to all undergraduate students across the university, so not only tourism scholars or students coming from spatial design, but anything. So for example, we can have students from law, from dental hygiene, from kind of agri-food science, in a group with, for example, tourism students, architectural students, other built environment professions. And over a 1 semester, they respond to a local challenge, and they develop, using design thinking, proposals based on deep qualitative engagement with the local community in terms of identifying what the needs are of those local communities. And in a place like Rotterdam, where there's no such thing as one community, that can be very, very difficult. Based on those insights from an engagement, they develop prototypes which they test, and they invite in populations into that testing process, which then emerge. So we have a whole kind of set of tools that we use. For example, this is something called the Kissing and Pissing Index. And we use this to ask students to think, okay, are there places in the area that might be nice where you can sit and kiss your girlfriend or boyfriend, or are there places in the area that may be more conducive to someone taking a wee? And this helps us understand the context of how different stakeholders engage with place and the lived experience of different stakeholders, because this isn't the same for everyone. And part of our work is engaging with historically excluded populations, so people that haven't always been part of a design process. For example, our living lab is located in an area of Rotterdam that has 5 detox centers concentrated around it. So we have a lot of homeless people or people that suffer from homelessness or homeless-related kind of issues. We have people maybe that might have significant addiction problems that use the spaces in which we're looking to improve. So we seek to engage with these issues through both research and education. And in our living lab, we have stopped running the minor because we used to get a lot of international students that would participate in that, and because of the neoliberal context of urban development in Rotterdam, we don't have any more international students because we have a living crisis that promotes young professionals among other high-earning young professionals, other stakeholders. So we, at a city level, can't really accept Erasmus students. So if anyone is looking to go on Erasmus in Rotterdam, you might need to choose somewhere else in the Netherlands. So this is what we're doing in the Living Lab as a result of that is that we're pairing graduation students with some of our stakeholder ecosystem, and they are doing deeper levels of investigation, but working with the same set of tools, so also with design thinking. So to allow Living Labs to fulfill their potential, it's important to reflect on how they can be used in a planning context, both conceptually and in practice, towards regenerative practice. And as I said before, I think what we're seeking to do here is incrementally contribute to social transitions in a positive way. And that's why we use the lens of tourism, which doesn't always resonate with people, and certainly in these peripheral communities that have they're not even visited by other Rotterdammers. So to talk to them about tourism as a kind of urban development tool can be very, very tricky, especially, as I said, they're only, we have less than 20% voting participation. So we understand that this whole process is slow, and it's long, and it's careful. It's based on building relationships, and therefore we rely on similar methods than we've heard this morning to build those relationships. And one of them is arts and culture. So I think that there is a definite legacy from Jeroen's work in what I'm going to show to you today, which also resonates with some of the kind of engagement-led work that we saw, that great work that we saw just before the break that's happening here in your own city and some of the cities in Bulgaria. So in terms of living labs and their limitations in socio-spatial practice, sometimes there's little attention given to upscaling and questions about even if that's possible. And to be honest, there's no one size that fits all. Ideas are as place-based as places themselves. So for example, something that might work in one neighborhood isn't necessarily just going to be able to be, copied and pasted in another. And this is because you need to have local ownership for those implementations, and that's not always at the top of our mind. That's not always at the top of other stakeholders in our ecosystem's mind, although that's critical to our work. And when I was looking, I suppose, at the presentations at the start of the morning that were, I suppose, criticizing the individualism that has existed here, I suppose, in the post-socialist times. We have to engage with that also kind of in the context of where we work. And the question of ownership is very, very important. So do locals feel that they have ownership over their neighborhoods, over the spaces that are outside? Is that collective ownership? Or is it individualistic in terms of parking the red car and stopping a space from being free for children to play or other stakeholders to take advantage of that. In my academic background, I've done research in Khrushchevki in Moscow and also in Yugoslav housing systems in Novi Beograd, so I have some experience, I suppose, with what you're engaging with here in Sofia and Bulgaria more generally. So we try to engage as much as possible with the underlying structural processes and power relations that are underestimated. So how can living labs act as a forum to activate or to encourage activism within the general population? Something that we do engage with or we do suffer from is participation fatigue. Obviously, if stakeholders don't feel that there's an adequate feedback loop between what we do and what they see in terms of development, then they often step out. Living labs are en vogue, so they're appreciated by politicians and European funding funders. So living labs are very much pop in terms of some of the recent kind of European funding systems. They're interesting for researchers. Noteworthy activities can reach the media, and you'll see it in the example that I'll show you. As I said, useful for grant applications, and upscaling is not necessarily a goal in itself, but it should be about fertilizing the ground for change. So what we are doing is very much about readying the territory for seeding, for more longer-term interventions. So this, I suppose, could be understood as urban acupuncture. It's about bringing people together. It's about taking the wisdom of the community, so valorizing tacit knowledge of the lived experience of the people that live in the places that we're talking about, and not essentially working in a top-down, ego-driven way. And sometimes, I suppose, in architectural and urban design practice, we can be led to believe that there's a kind of cult of personality around the designer, but we know that in every project, it's a design team that puts together, an eventual realization, and there's no winner in terms of a guru or a leading person. So I suppose we try to de-egotize the process of planning. And within that, it's about learning how to navigate complexity together. And a future goal of what we want to do is to move into a model that's more like developing a production house. So we have constant iterative prototypes that are being taken off the shelf by new participants and being redeveloped by others. How are we doing for time, by the way? Kind of. Okay, I'll try to go a bit quicker. Okay, so we, as I said, work with the paradigm also of regenerative design, and this is about, I suppose, being regenerative in terms of understanding the story of places, understanding the interdependence between kind of nested systems at a local level and bigger systems at the higher scale, understanding flows, patterns, understanding that there are various types of wisdom, not only expertise, in terms of academic or intellectual expertise, but also other types. Understanding that the cities and places that we live in are living systems, and using systems thinking paradigms to influence that. And working, I suppose, more of a mindset than and a lifestyle, and moving from potential to, or from problem to potential. So a lot of it is about, I suppose, connecting concepts from urban renewal and placemaking towards abundance and thriving places and enabling stewardship. And that is about, I suppose, developing the local community to take ownership of the prototypes that we develop, and in legacy mode for them to take on these ideas. And just like we heard kind of from the presentations before, and certainly kind of what Valerie was talking about, it's about developing active, engaged citizens that are able to thrive and support their own places to live. In this way, you create agents of change, agents of thriving in abundance, developing irresistible narratives, and narrative is really important to our work. So in order to counteract this, I suppose, individualism that exists in a neoliberal capitalist society, and being mindful that, I suppose, given the shock therapy of economic transition in the 90s for a lot of countries kind of in Eastern Europe, it's about developing new narratives to understand community and collectivism. And some of that is about looking back to systems that have been potentially, how would I say this, that have been politicized, but hold a lot of value for our future. So there are systems that existed here under the old, regime that have lessons for us in building new narratives around commons and around how we live together. Okay, so in this way, regenerative development is a way to do this. It's a process that supports the understanding of potential of place. It's about designing relationships. It's around creating mutual beneficial outcomes within a place. So just as we heard there, multiple functions that can kind of create multiplier effects. Regenerative place development and design perspectives create conditions for life. So again, it's really about building narratives for change that people can buy into. And being more in the service of the community, building long-term relationships and fertilizing the soil. If you want to find out more about what we do in our work, colleagues of mine have written a book about learning in a living lab, which you should check out. And I'm going to use this, I suppose, case study of a project that we have in Rotterdam Zuid called Mi Lobi Zuid, which in Surinaamse Creole means I love Zuid. And as I said, the area that we are in has 185 different languages spoken, one of them which is Surinaams. And this project was very much around helping us understand how, and counteracting participation fatigue, how to activate agency within our local community. As I said, we interact with a very, very low trust environment where people are very suspicious. For example, interventions around urban greening or urban drainage, which are really, really critical for Rotterdam, which is, as I said, a concrete city built around the car. These can be perceived as gentrification mechanisms in Rotterdam, so we have to be very, very careful with how we work. So this project was about, I suppose, building that trust, because we understand that what we do is an incremental process, and if we don't have that trust, we're going to get nowhere. We will have no participation in our prototyping, There'll be no ownership over the outcomes. There'll be no legacy because that ownership will mean that there's no agents of change that we can source that participate with us in that co-creation process. So this project emerged from a graduation project of one of our students who was a leisure and events management student, and he joined forces with a local artist called Naomi Rosalia King, so Joris Sauerbar is his name. And as I said, obviously this has some resonance in Jeroen's work, which is known in the Netherlands, and I have to acknowledge that because I suppose there's something very interesting about that practice, which was happening with historically excluded communities in the global south, although I hate that term, the global south, bringing that back to Rotterdam south. So that project, how do I go back? So that project was about engaging the local community in the realization of this urban mural on our building. As I said, this was an old ABN AMRO bank. It's kind of got this POMO kind of 90s style, but it sits within a very kind of neglected urban space. Although right next to a place that has been gentrified, called Hart van Zuid, which is the heart of the South, led in a very top-down, developer-led way, with very little real community kind of involvement in either that place branding or in that development process. So we understand that for the long-term legacy of our work that we need to build these relationships based on trust. So we invited the community to participate with us in the realization of this mural. Before I kind of tell you and finish about some of the things that happened around that project, I just want to say what we have learned in our practice in terms of what can make or break interventions. And this is related, I suppose, to why we did this urban mural project. So we understand that our role is about holding space. We can be a neutral actor. We are not the gemeente. We're not the Opstina. We can represent a connecting tissue kind of between different actors, or a glue that brings the community together. We try to be a fountain of inspiration. So the lab ecosystem must provide energy and resources to revitalize and seed ideas to flourish. Feedback loops are very insightful and have led to several adjustments for the following lab tracks. Long-term presence, I said, very, very important. So even though this building is going to be slated for demolition in the next 2 years, we will have to find somewhere else to be. We need to be in Zuid, potentially all at the same time as we're in other parts of the city, building that trust, staying in the community, demonstrating a legacy of experimentation, and thus reflection is really, really important to our work. And this is something that happens equally in the collective. So it's about collectively reflecting. What can break interventions? I suppose getting stuck in ideation, so getting stuck in the design process and not moving past ideas to prototypes that can be tested, and then obviously getting that data, just like we heard in the first presentation, to inform our own process and how development might work. Also, lack of local ownership. So if we're essentially doing things to the community in a top-down way as opposed to with the community, we're never going to build that trust. And then, as I said, no local ownership over the outcomes. So we have a duty of care to our stakeholders to develop a collective ownership for what we do. Often there's resentment against the intervention in the same way as we heard from others today, because not everyone, design and development, like any kind of other form of art or culture, is subjective. So sometimes we have resentment against the intervention. It could be perceived to be gentrification-led. So we need to be sensitive towards the place and the community. If you want to learn more about that, there's several chapters, for example, and when you see the slides, when colleagues share the slides, there's some other references there. Okay, so just to, before I kind of give the final I suppose, summary about what our work about Milo Zuid, just talk about the other sorts of prototypes that emerged from our lab. The first one here was something called the Empower Her Path, which was improving safety and security in the areas that we work in, especially for medewerkers, or for employees of Lidl or Billa, or it was Albert Heijn in our case. So they made this track, this kind of illuminated kind of track that when you finish work at 9 or 10 and you're on your own and you're feeling very maybe vulnerable as a woman, that you can press something and it'll light up, and it will kind of I suppose bring those eyes on the street in the Jane Jacobs way, although it could also attract something horrendous. So we also have, for example, the second prototype is what the precursor to the Mille Lobby South project was, and if you go on our website, you'll find out loads about the prototypes. Okay. Lastly, we learned a lot through this project, and while we were doing the co-painting, and I was also painting, and young people, old people, it was a lot of fun. We asked people about urban development. So we had these very soft questions about urban development, about what they want, what they would like to see, a very qualitative process that went alongside this. And softly, and you're just painting with the paintbrush, and someone's asking you about urban development, and it seems kind of slightly, potentially you might be more honest when you're in that kind of comfortable position. So we asked people, I suppose, as well, why participate? And the question of participation was raised several times in the questions that were put to other people on the panel before. So I thought that this would be useful to include here. People appreciate colour in the neighbourhoods, both literally and figuratively. One reason that people wanted to participate because maybe their friends or the artists or the organizers invited them, but for others it was about conviviality and being part of a whole and performing community in practice. It was often relaxing and soothing to do so, even zen. So there's a lot of personal motivations for why people might want to participate in projects. And this will probably resonate from the great work that we heard this morning. Some people don't want to participate. They might fear of getting their clothes dirty, or they might not want to interact with other people. They feel they might have lack of time or skill, or in the case of our building, because it's going to be demolished anyway in the next few years, it's going to go away, so why should they contribute? But we did have a lot of contributing, and as you see here, these are some of the views that local people came up with in terms of their suggestions for the neighbourhood. And lastly, I just wanted to put Alvin, who was one of the guys who lives in one of the detox centres that was close to us, and he was with us throughout the project. And he also, I suppose, when we launched the project, he set up a little stall so he could sell his own artwork, because he's an artist, but has gone through a lot of personal difficulties. I have more here, but I've gone over time. And the second bit was, I suppose, about kind of showing how to exercise these methods in other contexts. And I was going to tell you a little story of how I'm bringing those methods to my own city of Cork in Ireland. But you can be in touch with me, and I'd be delighted to tell you about that. But Blagodaria, thank you for listening. I hope it wasn't too academic and boring. And please be in touch if I can, help you in any way in activating your own communities and doing this sort of practice, like the great stuff we've seen. Blagodaria.
Така, имаме време за 1, 2, максимум 3 въпроса в рамките на 5 минути. Някой има ли въпрос, който иска да зададе?
I'll take advantage of what you said that you will not be able to say right now because of lack of time. How did you bring this to your hometown?
Oh, thank you. Gurv Malgut, which means thank you in Irish, if anyone wants to know. So my own city suffers significantly from dereliction because in the last, I suppose in the 2 decades that Ireland, or 3 now, that Ireland went from kind of Europe's poorest cousin, which might be familiar, I suppose, to some people, and now to this neoliberal kind of fantasy-scape. My city, which is Port City, the second city of the Republic of Ireland, Cork, didn't really see any of this spatial change that you might see if you go to Dublin Docklands and visit Google or LinkedIn or Facebook. So we have a significant problem with dereliction, and dereliction is when buildings are left to rot for some developer to seek some speculative kind of profit, some distant place in the future that never happens. And I know that, for example, that also is a problem here in Bulgaria. And one of my master's students looked at this context in Plovdiv, especially around some of the areas that we saw this morning, which have been activated and brought back to life, potentially also with issues to do with gentrification, like we heard. So taking this process to Cork, we've done a few kind of walking-led exercises with activists to kind of probe the context of dereliction in Cork and try to develop local ownership for buildings. In the colonial period, when Ireland was the colony of the British Empire, Cork was a node to use to colonize other countries, primarily in the Caribbean and South America. So we have a lot of warehousing architecture that's not necessarily of us, that's in a British colonial style or sometimes in a Dutch style. Given the fact that Irish Gaelic populations weren't really able to actively participate in urban development up until the independence of the state, we have a big problem with developing local ownership for this sort of built heritage, which is seen to be potentially British or reminiscent of the empire and the presence of that. So what we're trying to do is use this type of engagement-led methodology to do kind of happenings in the city, try to develop local ownership for the built environment. This is difficult in Ireland in particular because we've been told for a long time that cities are incompatible with our rural kind of cow shed way of life, which is not true because we've had cities, as long as for hundreds of years. So to, in a very long way, answer your question, trying to do similar engagement-led kind of processes there to activate local ownership over the built environment. I hope that answers your question in some way. I'm sure you're all bored of listening to me now at this point.
Thank you very much. I have a question which is maybe not directly related to your work, but I was wondering, you mentioned there are no international students anymore, or you cannot accept international students anymore. And do you see a role for your living lab in resolving this issue?
Absolutely. So one thing that I'm hoping to do personally is to set up a BIP, like a blended intensive program, which is a short Erasmus mobility, which is designed by the EU to facilitate mobility for students in the context of this, living housing crisis that we have all over Europe. So that would be a 1 week, maybe, program where we would invite students from a set of different disciplines to look at this topic and look at maybe the context of how this interacts with Airbnb in the city and other extractive forms of urban exploitation. So that would be a way, but also through research, I suppose, so maybe we can talk about that ourselves.